The crossguard has been standard safety engineering in sword design since roughly the 13th century. Over 800 years of battlefield iteration, and the principle never changed. Put a solid bar between the blade and your fingers so you get to keep them. But in Star Wars, somebody looked at that 800-year-old principle and said, what if we made the crossguard out of the same thing that cuts hands off? A crossguard lightsaber is supposed to protect your hands. But if the crossguard itself is made of plasma, doesn't that defeat its own purpose? That question is going to be the thread we pull for the next few minutes. And fair warning, once you pull it, the whole thing starts to unravel. Because this isn't another rundown of every lightsaber variant that's ever shown up in Star Wars. Not doing that. What we're doing is stress testing. Taking the most iconic lightsaber designs in the franchise, applying roughly 10 seconds of actual engineering thought to each one, and sorting them into two piles. Designs that are quietly brilliant, and designs that are engineering disasters, waiting to maim their own wielder before the enemy ever gets close. Star Wars designs for the camera first. Always has. And that's fine. It's a space opera, not an engineering textbook. But when you start thinking about certain designs for even a moment, the gap between what looks cool and what actually makes sense becomes genuinely kind of hilarious. And in at least one case, the fix is so blindingly obvious that an entire galaxy of geniuses should be embarrassed nobody thought of it. So let's pull. First though, quick foundation. You need this for everything that comes after. A lightsaber is built around a kyber crystal sitting inside a hilt, surrounded by a power cell, a focusing lens, and a blade emitter. Hit the switch, and the crystal converts stored energy into superheated plasma. A magnetic containment field shapes that plasma into the rigid blade you recognize from every poster, lunchbox, and tattoo in existence. That containment field is doing all the real work, because actual plasma, in our universe at least, is ionized gas that disperses immediately. It doesn't hold a shape. It doesn't become a glowing sword. But in the fiction, the field creates a plasma loop. Energy arcs out from the emitter and cycles back into the hilt, which gives the blade a fixed length instead of spraying outward like a flamethrower. Here's the part that matters for later. The blade has essentially no mass. But multiple canon sources describe something called gyroscopic resistance. The plasma loop generating a pull that fights you when you try to change direction, like swinging a spinning flywheel. For a Force user, manageable. For anyone else, problem. Big problem. We'll come back to that. One more thing. Assembling the kyber crystal inside the hilt requires the Force. You literally cannot build one without Force sensitivity. So from the jump, from the very first step of construction, this is a weapon designed by Force users for Force users, with a build process that locks everyone else out. Keep that in mind. Okay, November 2014. The first teaser for The Force Awakens drops, and audiences see a lightsaber with a crossguard for the first time in live-action Star Wars. Kylo Ren's weapon instantly became the single most debated design in franchise history. Not because it looked wrong, because it looked right in a way that raised a question nobody could answer cleanly. The official lore gives us a specific explanation, and honestly, it's genuinely interesting. Kylo Ren's lightsaber is built around a cracked kyber crystal. Damaged. Unstable. It generates more energy than the primary blade emitter can safely handle, which means the weapon is, in a very real sense, barely holding itself together. Those two lateral blades sticking out the sides, the quillions, they're not decorative. They're pressure relief valves. They bleed off excess plasma that would otherwise cause the hilt to explode in his hand. That's why those side blades have that distinctive crackling, spitting, ragged look compared to a clean lightsaber blade. The plasma coming through those vents is raw, improperly focused, dangerous looking because it genuinely is dangerous. The design is described as ancient, based on a template that predates the refined construction techniques of the prequel-era Jedi Order. And this is where the history gets interesting, because that ancient template isn't just vague lore, there's a specific location tied to it. The Jedi Temple on Malachor, featured in the Season 2 finale of Star Wars Rebels, is a battlefield graveyard. Thousands of years before the events of the films, a catastrophic conflict, the Great Scourge of Malachor, wiped out Jedi and Sith combatants alike, leaving petrified bodies scattered across a scorched landscape. Among the wreckage, ancient lightsabers with crossguard configurations. These weren't prototypes or curiosities, they were standard issue. An entire generation of Force users fought and died wielding crossguard lightsabers, which means this design was once considered reliable enough for war. But think about the conditions that would have produced that design philosophy. Early kyber crystal harvesting and alignment techniques were cruder. Crystals cracked more often. Energy output was harder to regulate. Lateral venting wasn't a workaround. It was probably a necessity for most lightsabers of that era. The crossguard wasn't born from combat theory. It was born from material limitations. And when crystal alignment improved over the millennia, the vents became unnecessary, and the crossguard design faded into obscurity. Kylo Ren reaching back to that ancient template isn't just aesthetic nostalgia. He's using it because his cracked crystal puts him in the same position those ancient warriors were in. He needs the vents for the same reason they did. The High Republic Publishing Initiative, which launched in January 2021 and is set roughly 200 years before the prequel films, also featured crossguard lightsabers. Jedi Master Stellan Gios wielded one built with a properly functioning crystal, not a cracked one. His version was a deliberate design choice, which means somebody in the Jedi Order at some point looked at the crossguard configuration and thought, yeah, this is good combat engineering. Were they right? Let's check. But okay, wait. Think about this for a second. Not in Star Wars terms, in real-world terms. Because a crossguard on a real sword has one job. One. And that job has been tested in actual combat across roughly 3 centuries of European martial history. The crossguard, a bar of metal perpendicular to the blade at the base of the grip, exists because of something that happens constantly when edged weapons meet. When 2 swords bind edge to edge, the blades create a contact point. Pressure and leverage at that contact point mean one blade can slide along the other's edge, riding it downward toward the hand holding the weapon. This isn't theoretical. This is one of the most fundamental realities of sword combat, and it shows up across every European longsword tradition from the 13th century forward. German fighting manuals, the Fechtbücher, describe techniques built entirely around this sliding principle. When fighters transition between positions, when they wind against each other's blades seeking advantage, there are moments where a blade is absolutely going to ride down toward the opposing fighter's grip. That's the crossguard's whole reason for being. Metal bar, perpendicular, catches the incoming blade, dead stop, your fingers stay attached. Here's what makes a metal crossguard work. Metal on metal is a definitive interaction. The incoming blade hits steel, and the energy transfer is predictable. It stops, or it glances off at an angle dictated by the crossguard's shape, but the crossguard itself doesn't move, doesn't yield, doesn't introduce new variables. By the 15th and 16th centuries, European swordsmiths had evolved crossguards into complex basket hilts and ring guards that enclosed the entire hand, because sword fighters kept finding new ways to get past simpler designs. The engineering principle never changed. Hard, fixed barrier between the incoming blade and your grip. Now apply that to Kylo Ren's weapon, or Stellan Gios's, or any crossguard lightsaber. An opponent's lightsaber slides down the main blade toward the wielder's hand. It hits the crossguard. The crossguard is plasma. 2 lightsaber blades don't pass through each other. They lock. So the opponent's blade would be stopped by the plasma quillon. In that narrow sense, sure, it works. But here's where everything breaks down, and it breaks down in multiple ways at once. First problem. When 2 plasma blades lock, the interaction is nothing like metal on metal. There's resistance, yes, but also energy discharge, electromagnetic interference from the competing containment fields, and, critically, unpredictable deflection. A metal crossguard absorbs impact and stops force definitively. Dead stop. End of interaction. A plasma crossguard creates a second point of blade-on-blade contact, with variable deflection angles depending on the speed, angle, and rotational energy of the incoming strike. You're not blocking the threat. You're redirecting it somewhere you can't fully predict. And one of the places it can redirect is laterally, right toward the wielder's own wrist. This gets worse when you consider how Kylo Ren actually fights. His combat style is heavy, aggressive, full of raw power strikes, closer to Form 5, Gem So, than anything elegant. Gem So is built around meeting force with force, batting aside incoming attacks with heavy counterstrikes. It's the form Anakin Skywalker favored. It generates enormous kinetic energy at the point of blade contact, which means the blades binding on Kylo's crossguard aren't gently sliding, they're slamming. More kinetic energy at the Quillon means more unpredictable deflection, more electromagnetic discharge, more chances for the incoming blade to bounce somewhere catastrophic. A Form 2 practitioner like Dooku, with his precise, economical blade work, would generate far less chaotic energy at the crossguard. But Kylo doesn't fight like Dooku. Kylo fights like a man trying to beat the ground to death with a shovel. And every time he does, those plasma quillons are absorbing forces they weren't optimized to redirect cleanly. Second problem. Look at any detailed illustration or prop recreation of Kylo Ren's hilt. There's a small but critical gap between the main blade emitter and the point where the lateral vent plasma actually begins. A tiny exposed section of metal housing sits right at the junction where the quillon meets the main body. This is the most vulnerable spot on the entire weapon. An opponent's blade sliding down with enough precision could catch in that gap, contacting the metal hilt itself, which a lightsaber would slice through like it wasn't there. A real crossguard is a continuous barrier. This one has a seam, and seams are where things fail. Third problem, and this one applies to Stellan Gios's version too, not just Kylo's. Even if the plasma quillons stop the incoming blade cleanly, with no weird deflection and no gap exploit, the crossguard still has a limitation that metal crossguards don't. A metal crossguard is always there, passive protection. You don't have to think about it, activate it, or maintain it. A plasma crossguard requires the weapon to be ignited. If the weapon deactivates, power failure, crystal disruption, cortosis contact, any of the dozen things that can kill a lightsaber blade, the crossguard vanishes. Your hand protection is contingent on your weapon functioning perfectly. That's a dependency no medieval swordsmith would have ever accepted, because the whole point of a crossguard is that it's the last line of defense when everything else goes wrong. 3 compounding problems. Unpredictable deflection. A vulnerable hardware gap. Protection that disappears the moment your weapon fails. That's not a crossguard. That's a liability wearing a crossguard's costume. And here's what elevates this from nitpick to genuine design failure. Nobody at Lucasfilm has ever addressed these specific vulnerabilities. The Force Awakens Visual Dictionary explains why Kylo's crossguard exists. Cracked crystal, energy venting, weapon would explode without it. Fine. But nobody has ever engaged with whether plasma quillons actually protect the hand as effectively as a solid crossguard would. The honest reading of the canon isn't, Kylo Ren chose this design because crossguards are tactically superior. It's closer to, his crystal is broken, the weapon would kill him without pressure relief vents, and the vents happen to stick out sideways in a way that accidentally resembles a crossguard. The franchise quietly lets everyone assume it's functional combat design, when the truth is it's a duct tape fix for a broken weapon that accidentally looks cool. Stellan Gios's version doesn't even have that excuse. His crystal isn't cracked. He chose this. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. But here's where it gets almost embarrassing for the world builders. Because the fix is sitting right there in the franchise's own canon, and nobody in universe has ever put the pieces together. Beskar. Mandalorian iron. You've seen it work. In The Mandalorian, which premiered in November 2019 and immediately became a cultural phenomenon, Din Djarin's full Beskar armor takes direct hits from blasters, melee weapons, and energy attacks without a scratch. By Season 3 and the Book of Boba Fett, Beskar's lightsaber-resistant properties were firmly locked into canon. The armorer forges it into armor and weapons with the explicit understanding that this is one of the very few substances in the galaxy that can turn aside a lightsaber blade. Go back even further. In the Clone Wars, Pre Vizsla swung the Darksaber against Jedi, while wielding a weapon with a bescar-infused hilt. Mandalorian warriors understood the principle of lightsaber-resistant melee weapons centuries before anyone in the sequel trilogy thought to ask the question. And bescar isn't the only option, but it's the best one. Cortosis, an ore that in the old expanded universe could actually short out a lightsaber blade on contact, temporarily deactivating the weapon, got reintroduced to current canon starting with the 2014 novel A New Dawn. It resists lightsabers, yes, but Cortosis has a problem bescar doesn't: inconsistency. Its signature property, killing a lightsaber blade on contact, gets handled differently depending on the source. Sometimes it shorts out the blade, sometimes it just resists. It survives lightsaber strikes, which is what matters, but a material whose defining behavior keeps shifting across canon isn't exactly the foundation you want for your last line of hand protection. Frick alloy is another candidate, used in the electrostaff weapons carried by General Grievous's Magna Guards. But Frick is extraordinarily rare, harder to forge, and doesn't have the cultural infrastructure bescar does. Mandalorians have been forging bescar for millennia. They know the metallurgy. The supply chain exists, strained, contested, but real. So bescar wins on every axis: durability, availability, proven track record against lightsaber-class weapons. It's the obvious answer. Now just picture it. Instead of plasma quillins that create deflection risks and have a vulnerable gap at the junction, imagine a crossguard made from bescar. A solid bar of Mandalorian iron, perpendicular to the blade, doing exactly what crossguards have done for 800 years of real-world sword design. Opponent's blade slides down, hits bescar, stops dead. No deflection randomness, no gap. No dependency on your weapon staying powered. Just hand protection. The way it was always supposed to work. Every single problem we just walked through, solved. By a metal bar. So why didn't anyone think of this? The in-universe answer is probably politics and scarcity. The Mandalorians and the Jedi fought a series of devastating wars. The Mandalorian-Jedi War is one of the defining conflicts in galactic history, referenced across the Clone Wars, Rebels, and The Mandalorian. Beskar is sacred to Mandalorian culture. They don't sell it casually. And they certainly wouldn't have handed it to the Jedi Order to improve Jedi weapons. The Jedi, for their part, probably never asked. Their philosophy leaned towards simplicity, the Force as the true weapon, the lightsaber as merely a focus. Asking a historical enemy for exotic metal to upgrade your sword hilt would have felt undignified. But that's an explanation, not a justification. Because by the era of the sequel trilogy, the Jedi Order is gone. The Mandalorian clans are scattered. Beskar shows up in black markets across the Outer Rim. Kylo Ren has the resources of the entire First Order behind him. Nobody, not Snoke, not the Knights of Ren, not a single First Order weapons engineer, looked at that crackling, sparking, unstable crossguard and said, "What if we just bolted a strip of Beskar across the hilt?" The technology exists. The material exists. The design principle is medieval. Nobody put them together. And now you will never watch a Kylo Ren fight scene the same way again. Sorry about that. Not really. So that's the case study in design failure. A weapon that looks like it solves a problem while quietly creating new ones. But if all we did was tear things down, this would just be angry nerd territory, and that's not what we're doing here. Because the crossguard's core failure is that it's a fixed design. One configuration, locked in, unable to adapt. And there's exactly one lightsaber in the franchise that took the opposite approach. One that almost nobody discusses from an engineering angle. One that got completely overlooked the last time this topic came up. Here's one they missed. Cal Kestis's lightsaber from Jedi Survivor might be the most practical weapon in the entire franchise, and barely anyone's talking about it. Respawn Entertainment released Jedi Survivor in April 2023. The game got tons of coverage for its combat system and its rough launch performance, but Cal's lightsaber deserves its own moment, because this thing is a modular weapon system. One hilt, 5 distinct combat configurations. Default mode, Standard single-blade lightsaber. Twist and extend the hilt, it becomes a double-bladed staff weapon with plasma on both ends. But here's where it gets clever. The hilt splits into two separate pieces, giving Cal a lightsaber in each hand for dual wielding. Jedi Survivor then added two more configurations on top of that. Crossguard stance reconfigures the emitter for a heavier, broader blade with lateral quillions. Basically a greatsword, trading speed for power. And the blaster stance pairs a lightsaber in one hand with an integrated blaster pistol in the other, giving Cal ranged capability built directly into the weapon. One weapon, 5 jobs. Close quarters dueling, corridor clearing staff work, aggressive 2-weapon fighting, heavy greatsword strikes, ranged combat, without carrying a separate tool for each scenario. This is the lightsaber equivalent of what modern military forces have been chasing for decades with modular firearms platforms. Rifles with swappable barrel lengths, detachable grenade launchers, configurable optics. The principle is identical. You don't want to carry 5 weapons into the field. You want one weapon that adapts to 5 situations. And the contrast with the crossguard couldn't be sharper. Kylo Ren's lightsaber has one configuration that creates problems it can't solve. Cal's lightsaber has 5 configurations, precisely because no single setup solves every problem. The crossguard is a monument to fixed thinking. One crystal, one flaw, one permanent workaround that introduces new risks. Cal's weapon is the engineering rebuttal. It says, what if the weapon changed to fit the fight, instead of forcing the fighter to work around the weapon's limitations? People noticed on their own. Commenters independently called it one of the most practical sabers in Star Wars. They were dead right. Every other lightsaber in the franchise is locked into a single configuration. Maul's double blade is always a double blade. Kylo's crossguard is always a crossguard. Dooku's curved hilt, which, credit where it's due, borrows from real fencing saber ergonomics for a Form 2 dueling advantage, is always a curved hilt. Ahsoka's dual-wield setup, with a shorter Shoto blade for defense, is actually smart engineering, but she's still carrying 2 separate weapons, not one adaptable system. Cal's weapon is the only lightsaber in canon, and the games are canon, Lucasfilm confirmed this, that treats configuration as a variable instead of a constant. Swiss Army knife in a universe of fixed-blade knives. And the fact that this came from a game studio, not from Lucasfilm's core design team, says something kind of fascinating about where practical thinking actually lives in this franchise. In studios that have to make weapons function as interactive systems players use for 40 hours, not just look cool in a single shot. Now, on the complete opposite end of the engineering spectrum, and I do mean the complete opposite, we need to spend about 30 seconds on the Inquisitor lightsaber from Star Wars Rebels, which premiered on Disney XD in October 2014. The Inquisitors carry double-bladed, spinning lightsabers. Blades rotate on a ring mechanism, creating a buzzsaw defensive barrier. Already a stretch, but fine. It looks threatening. Then, in Season 2, the show revealed the spinning function also lets them fly. They hold the spinning saber above their heads, and it generates lift. Like a helicopter. A plasma helicopter. Plasma has negligible mass. It doesn't displace air. It doesn't generate thrust. The community's verdict was instant and permanent. This is, by broad consensus, the single dumbest design choice in Star Wars history. It doesn't just defeat its own purpose, it invents a new purpose, attaches it to a weapon, and defeats that one too. Anyway, let's answer something the audience has been asking directly, because last time this came up, it got dodged, and that's not happening again. Can a non-force sensitive person pick up a lightsaber and use it? Yes. Straight up, yes. There's no force-sensitive biometric lock on a lightsaber. Anyone can hit the switch. Han Solo uses Luke's lightsaber to cut open a dead Tauntaun in Empire Strikes Back. No force sensitivity whatsoever, though he's slicing a stationary carcass, not fighting a Sith Lord. Finn, a former stormtrooper with no established force connection at that point, ignites the Skywalker saber in The Force Awakens and fights Kylo Ren directly. He loses badly, takes a devastating back injury, but he activates it, swings it, even lands a hit. General Grievous, who is emphatically not force sensitive, collected lightsabers from Jedi he killed, and wielded up to 4 simultaneously, using cybernetic enhancements that pushed his speed and limb articulation way beyond biological limits. Pre-Vizsla of Death Watch swung the Darksaber against Obi-Wan Kenobi and Darth Maul, drawing on a Mandalorian combat tradition specifically built to counter Force users. So the direct answer, no hedging, no, well, it depends. Can you physically hold and swing one? Absolutely. Can you use it for basic tasks? Cutting through a door, opening a tauntaun, intimidating someone? No question. Can you use it effectively in sustained combat against a trained Force user? Almost certainly not. Here's why. Lightsaber combat at the Jedi and Sith level relies on precognition, sensing attacks before they happen, reflexes faster than conscious thought, telekinetic augmentation, pulling the blade into position through the Force. The lightsaber is the output device. The Force is the operating system. Using a lightsaber without the Force is like driving a Formula One car without the telemetry, without the pit crew radio, and without the ability to see more than 50 meters ahead. The car still moves. You can technically steer, but you are not competitive. And if the track has walls, you are eventually going to hit one. Add in that gyroscopic resistance from the plasma loop, the blades subtly fighting your direction changes, and every fast swing becomes a gamble for someone who doesn't have the Force smoothing things out. In a slow, deliberate cut, irrelevant. In combat against a weapon that removes limbs on contact, including your own, that gyroscopic misbehavior will kill you before your opponent does. So here's the pattern that falls out of all this, and it's one the franchise has never explicitly acknowledged. Lightsaber designs exist on a spectrum. That spectrum has nothing to do with light side versus dark side. It runs from designed to look incredible on camera to designed to actually work. At one end, the Inquisitor helicopter, pure spectacle, zero function. Next, Kylo Ren's crossguard, visually stunning, canonically explained, functionally compromised in ways nobody official has ever addressed, with the fix so obvious it's almost insulting. A bar of bescar, the same material Mandalorians have been forging for millennia, sitting unused while plasma quillins crackle and spark and threaten their own wielder's hands. And at the practical end, sitting quietly and getting nowhere near enough credit, Cal Kestis's modular lightsaber. The one design in the entire franchise that treats a lightsaber as a weapon system instead of a fixed artifact. The franchise will never fully bridge this gap. Honestly, it shouldn't try too hard. Star Wars is mythic space opera, not a tactical simulation, and the moment lightsaber design becomes too rational, it loses the visual language that makes these weapons iconic in the first place. Kylo Ren's crackling crossguard tells you everything about the character the instant you see it. Unstable, dangerous, reaching for an ancient power he can't fully control. That storytelling is worth more than a mechanically optimal Beskar crossguard ever could be. But that's the filmmaker's answer. The engineer's answer is different. The engineer looks at that crossguard and says, "You could fix this. The material exists. The principle is 800 years old. And nobody in a galaxy full of hyperdrives and planet-killing superweapons ever thought to slap a bar of Beskar on the hilt. So now it's your turn. Forget which lightsaber looks the coolest. That's a design question, and design is subjective. Think about which one actually works. Which lightsaber would you actually trust with your life in a real duel? Not which one you'd hang on your wall. Which one you'd carry into a fight, knowing the weapon has to perform, has to protect you, has to not defeat its own purpose. Because now you know the difference, and you're never going to unsee it. Every time Kylo Ren locks blades with someone, and that crackling crossguard flares, you're going to think about Beskar. Every time an Inquisitor spins up for liftoff, you're going to hear the word thrust and start laughing. And every time Cal Kestis twists his hilt and shifts stance mid-fight, you're going to nod and think, yeah, that one. That's the one that actually works. The engineer's clipboard is yours now. Drop your answer in the comments and subscribe if you want more like this.